Sometimes, for no reason at all, a higher power gives me the idea for a game, a show, or a piece that absolutely captivates me in every conceivable way. But I find that sometimes the ideas that I come up with are far harder to execute than I intend. This time it's because of how constricted I am in terms of the medium I've chosen. Today I've been given the idea for a tabletop RPG, and I can't stop thinking about it. In a sense, this is going to be what I envision it to look like, as well as a deconstruction of Warhammer 40k. D&D catches a couple strays too, but don't tell Wizards of the Coast. Some of my favourite games of all time are RPGs, and as I've grown older, I've begun to take deep dives into just how far the concept of an RPG can be pushed. I've taken the plunge into CRPGs and immersive sims, two different types of games that I feel tend to provide a far deeper and more fulfilling experience. The tabletop is naturally where my infatuation has led me as of today. I have an idea for a story and a tabletop experience that I believe is pretty good, but its implementation and gameplay is dependent on it being set in the Warhammer 40k universe. It's dependent on the gameplay of the tabletop game, and it's dependent on lifting all restrictions in place via the lore, the story, and the gameplay of Warhammer 40k itself. Which sounds somewhat counterintuitive, but I intend to fully explore and defend the statements I'm going to make. This will not be as deep and complex as the Dungeons & Dragons rule set. In fact, it takes little to no inspiration from that game at all, which is why I'm a little worried that it'll be terrible, because I think the deep complexities in D&D's rule set are probably more important than I realise. But to continue anyway, the point of my new tabletop RPG is to unbind the restrictions inherent to 40k to create a PvE experience that is simple, fun, and modifiable. This could mean that two factions that would never, ever in any scenario ally with each other can now do that. This could mean that rules and tactics used in previous editions of Warhammer 40k can be used again in a PvE setting. This ultimately means that my creative freedoms as a DM are not imposed by lore or gameplay restrictions that I don't like, whether it comes to D&D or Warhammer's rule set. By doing this in theory, it should create something uniquely entertaining. That's pretty vague. So, let's get specific. Warhammer 40k on tabletop aims to present you the opportunity to pilot armies of Xenos, Chaos, and Imperial origins, yet I think it constricts the player far more than it allows them to create something unique to them and enjoyable to play at the same time, because of how it's competitively balanced. D&D has had a system for combat since 1974. However, I can't help but think that the Warhammer 40k tabletop system can be ported to a tabletop RPG, albeit with its restrictions and rules loosened a little. There's a couple reasons I believe that this is worth trying. Most importantly, I think that it can create a new and interesting system that does something a little different and makes gameplay far less complicated. You start by picking a faction, then an infantry unit from that faction. That infantry unit already has all the stats you need baked into its model. Think of it like a pre-built kit for a hero shooter, or League of Legends. It comes with a passive ability, which is just the faction's army rule. Your abilities are picked from a set of stratagems, and the items you can equip to it are its infantry type. For example, as a Space Marine, your passive ability is Oath of Moment. You mark a target, and then you get full rerolls for attacks you make against it. The abilities you use in combat are stratagems you can use as per your faction. So for example, Armor of Contempt is a Space Marine stratagem that worsens the pen characteristic of enemy weapons by 1, etc, etc. Equipment found in the world changes the type of Marine you are. If you find a chainsword, for example, you can pick that up to become an Assault Intercessor. If you find Terminator armor in the wild, you can equip it to become a Terminator. If you find a bike, then use the profile of a bike marine thingy. This naturally means that when leveling up, the stats progression and specializing for subclasses are gone. In a way, the items you equip define your subclass. I think that leveling should unlock more stratagems and give you new abilities to reinforce your playstyle. For example, every third level, you get to choose one of 3 abilities to specialize your character into what you'd like to play. For Death Guard, a fun one I had thought of was something like this. The first time you are targeted with a weapon, ranged or melee, that has a strength characteristic higher than your base toughness, once per battle, you can become invulnerable to all damage from any source for that turn. Or for Blood Angels, you can once per battle give in to the Red Thirst. This gives you +2 to hit, devastating wounds, and +2 to pen, but you are uncontrollable for the rest of the battle. You can only target the closest enemy to you, you must charge at every given opportunity, and you cannot use any stratagems. If you are a Death Company unit, you may fight on death. The only problem with this system is that these stats that are dependent to make skill checks in the overworld are missing. Something integral to the game design of D&D, as well as the individualism and freedom to customize and create a character totally unique to you. I'd like to get ahead of those criticisms and say that this isn't what I'm aiming for, and that's intentional. While I absolutely adore games like Baldur's Gate, Pathfinder, and Rogue Trader, I'm aiming to create something far different to those games. I'm aiming to create a combat system and a game world that is far simpler and puts more emphasis on experiencing an already preset character. Also, parts of D&D frustrate me, so I don't want them. Lol. I don't like armor class. I hate that the evasion of a character is tied to their armor. More often than not, I find myself immensely ass-pained when missing attacks, because I feel that's not my fault that attacks are missing the target. It's mitigatable with certain items and spells, but I just hate the system so much that I think the game I'm creating would be far better off without it. Especially because saving throws are already sorted in a different way. For Warhammer, armor is inherently tied to the unit you're hitting. I don't like rolling 80 dice for one attack. I understand why D&D uses a D20 system, I just feel like it makes the game far more intricate in a way that hinders rather than enhances the experience. Warhammer Wrath and Glory, the latest D&D Warhammer conversion game, uses a D6 system, but it still requires rolling like 80 dice to achieve a success or fail with a weapon. You have to roll dice based on the number of skill is, and
don't
only
worry,
succeeds
just
on
roll
80 dice. When I think it's far easier to say, okay mate, you hit on 3s. Fuck! Party members or companions are kind of a microcosm of the world you're playing in. They should represent the themes and the story the world is trying to offer, so restriction as to who your party members can be is almost always a negative in my eyes. I think that party members in any RPG are almost like a good joke, one that can be told in one single sentence. An undead bounty hunter, a pirate queen, and a shirtless buff guy walk into a bar. That's the joke. The Ruined King game, as an example, takes characters from all across Runeterra and places them squarely in one place with one goal. Almost none of them get along with each other. Save for some small romances or ideological agreements, they all have to sleep with one eye open. That's the beauty of this party. Their dynamic is interesting enough to warrant them working together, as well as the fact that they're likable enough to enjoy the little moments of bickering and fighting. That same idea can be applied to any number of parties in any other RPG for that matter. A tiefling thief, a noble crusader, and a wealthy hedonist walk into a bar. A human who's a monster that's more human than the human, and the human's monster walk into a bar. That probably is a little bit of an underrepresentation of those characters, but it's not just the wide variety of people you encounter. It's how their background shapes how they think and who they are. Another serious factor is that I don't like having to restrict what players can or cannot play on the tabletop. If you like chaos, and that's it, the expectation is that you suck it up and play something else. I hate that with a passion. And if it was asked of me, I wouldn't play at all. Why would I waste my time on a game that doesn't let me play the way I like? Now, for the greatest joke of all. A Tyranid warrior, a Death Shroud Terminator, and a Kriegsman walk into a bar. Here's the punchline. No, they fucking don't. Not under normal circumstances anyway. But I think that when restrictions are lifted and you force these characters to cooperate with each other in some way, I think that wildly interesting story moments can be set up to form a unique experience on the tabletop. They don't necessarily have to like each other. In fact, I think the point should be that they don't. Each of these factions have a deep, unrelenting hatred for each other, and if they could, would eradicate the entirety of each other's faction. An interesting group dynamic doesn't always have to be buddy-buddy, but it does have to be compelling enough to create moments in game that bring deep and meaningful insight into the world around them. In this instance, I think their hatred of one another can inform their choices. I'd really like players to really consider the role of their character and the obligation to their faction over the health of a party in a roleplay sense. Wow, that sounds fucking horrible. One more little thing to consider is one of the companions in Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous. Her name is Arushale, lol, and her point is that she is a demon. One of the enemies the entire campaign is fighting against, but she's the most interesting and well thought out character in the entire game. The point of me bringing her up and showing Arushale in general is that I think that value is gained when characters from all sides of any universe are given the opportunity to take part in a party setting. I don't intend for any of this to disrespect the already built up canon. There are many hundreds of books about this game that literally cover 10,000 years worth of history. All I'm trying to propose is that somewhere amidst that 10,000 years, there were 3 different entities from 3 entirely different factions that came together one time, out of necessity for their survival. Not to say that's even canon either, by the way. I'm fucking Oxygen Andy over here. Fucking, can I please use Death Guard and Tyranids in the same stuff? Bro, no one gives a fuck, man. It's just an excuse to remove the limits in place by giving an in-world explanation for an opportunity to do something that I think is really cool. That's it. To put a lid on a project you most likely will never see again. Well, there it goes, boys. I think that there can be more to gain out of 40k's gameplay and even story than what is currently available on the table. Horde mode is one amazing PvE experience that does exactly everything I'd love to see out of Warhammer. More ways to play with these little models, and more ways to write for the lore that isn't there. There are hundreds, if not like thousands, probably, of books about Space Marines, and there is very little to almost no material that tells about Tyranids from their perspective. That's painfully boring, and I believe a disservice to the faction, to be honest, especially because it's possible, it's been done before, and holds great potential for some really inspired storytelling.